Are we live? Hey everyone, welcome to the Tom's Hardware Podcast for February 7th, 2023. Uh, I'm your host, I'm editor in chief, Tom's Hardware editor in chief, Avram Pilch. I'm joined as always by Raspberry Pi expert Ash Hill and our very special guest, friend of the show, friend of the site, who has done a lot of writing for us. 3D printing expert Andrew Sink is joining us today to talk about a topic that is um, somewhat relevant to Pi, but also relevant to anyone who's in the maker community and doing 3D printing, which is using AI, hot topic of the moment, uh, to um, to create 3D models. So, Andrew, how have you been doing?
Yeah, I've been doing great. Thanks for asking. Yeah, really exciting time to be in technology in general. I think AI is definitely something that's been a buzzword for a long time. And I think I've heard that phrase that AI has been a buzzword for a long time, many times too. So it's really cool to see it finally. It feels like exponential growth recently. Like I can't, everywhere I go, I read about new AI artwork tools or AI copywriting tools. It seems like it kind of came out of nowhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also, speaking as someone who writes for a living, which obviously leaves me with some biases about authorship and content ownership, is very controversial because you have publishers, content providers of various kinds, saying, "Hey, these AIs are are learning from our work. AI is not going out and is not going out and testing a 3D printer. It doesn't have hands and eyes. I mean, maybe someday they'll have that, but not right now. So AIs are not don't have any experiences. They're drawing from the work of humans, and those humans are not being often not being credited and definitely not being compensated for that because the AI obscures what the source is. So I was just before watching the coverage of Microsoft's announcements around Bing and Edge and how they are using their AI, and some of it is they mention the sources, but just like in tiny font in passing at the bottom, and they don't actually even footnote it. It's just like, if you want to learn more, see these websites, which are basically websites that we took this data from without permission. So, um, it's a real question. And then Google showed a screenshot yesterday of its upcoming Bard, which shows that like which has no citations at all and just has like take the actual search results are below the fold, but then like you've got the chat giving you an answer that some people may consider good enough, and nobody knows exactly where it came from. So those are all, I don't know, issues to get into as you talk about like um, about AI. Is like, it's obviously from the user perspective a good tool, although if you're looking for information from AI, you need to be wary about where that information came from. If you're looking for it to create something new, uh, you know, which might, if you want to create something new, then you might end up with, then you'll end up with something probably pretty decent, which is, I guess, what we're really talking about. We talk about asking AI to do a design for us. So, how have you been using AI, Andrew?
Yeah, that's a great question. But before we get to that, there's a lot that you just kind of went into. That's like there's like 100 layers to this onion, right? Like there's a lot going on. And there's a statistician named Edward Tufte who talks a lot about data and interpreting data. And something he said is that it's really important to pay attention to when you're reading a letter or a press release that it's signed by people and not companies because there's accountability there, right? So
Right.
when somebody tells you to do something and they have their name attached to it, you're like, oh yeah, this person is telling me this is how it's done, versus sort of like a, sincerely the customer service department where there's no real attribution there.
Yeah,
Um,
I obviously I think that. Obviously, I agree with that. I think I think people matter, and I think expertise matters. So I would much sooner trust something that was attached to a human. But obviously, for some people, they're just going to look at whatever there is spat out at them, and it's going to possibly be not as good information. So there's like an economic side to it, which is like you're going to really hurt people who make their living doing this by basically stealing their work. But then there's also the quality side of it, which is if I can't trust anybody, if there's nobody standing behind it, how do I know I can trust it?
yeah.
The Google AI example that they had was somebody asked the AI a question of, is it easier to learn guitar or piano, and
Mhm.
and how much practice do you need? And the AI spat something out that was very like mealy mouthed. It was like, well, some say it's a piano and some say it's guitar. I'm not really going to give you an answer. Like a human would probably have an opinion on this. And then it says some music teachers often tell students that they must practice that. Well, that sounds pretty fair. Source information. I think I lost all there. Okay. So anyway, I mean that's really the question. But if you're just asking the AI to do something smart, like craft me a model, that is a really good use of AI, because some of us just don't have the skill to to do some of those things.
And on that subject, I think there's two different, well, the problem with the two different aspects to this, but when it comes to where you get the data that you're training your model from and the product that you're producing with it, if you're taking information and the information that it spits out is directly from another source, like if I'm saying, um, here's this book, and then the AI is like, here's the answer to your question, and you don't know that it came from this book, that's different, I think, than AI used for somewhat, I want to say, like artistic purposes, like Andrew's using 3D models. So you could say, hey, I want you to write me a banjo song, and then it could not give you a song from this book, but create something entirely new inspired from it. Just like I might read your article, Abram, and be inspired to write something similar, but is it taking components directly like plagiarism, or is it inspired like a person would be inspired?
Yeah,
And
you
that's
see,
where the area is really gray.
that's a great philosophical question, because do humans have a right to learn? But to like humans have a right to learn, right? Like I learn from reading a whole bunch of things, and then I do my own thing, and nobody says. And if it doesn't hew too closely to the things that I learned, then it's not plagiarism, and no one's complaining. But if you're a bot, do you have the right to learn like a person? Well, you certainly have. It's a little unfair because a bot has a lot more processing power than I do.
Yeah, so I'm here to talk about 3D models, and that's
Sorry.
what I'm really, no, it's okay. That's what I'm really good at talking about. The ethics of, is it okay for us to let a robot learn? That's a little outside my typical purview. So I don't have a solid answer for you there. But I do agree. It's definitely, and a lot of what you just said, it's going to tie right into something that we're about to go over, which is kind of a practical example of something that was designed by ChatGPT. So for anybody who's watching who is not familiar with ChatGPT, we can kind of start at the beginning. ChatGPT is basically a chatbot. So it's essentially a language model that you can use as a prompt. So it will provide you with a blank space where you can ask a question, and then it will give you an answer. That's the very simple way of looking at it. And from there, what we can extrapolate is that it's really good at answering some questions, but it struggles with others. And so when we think about what could we use this for, like what are some immediate applications, there are some things that make a lot of sense. Like for instance, to what Abram was saying, can you write a blog post about should I learn piano or should I learn guitar? Like probably, but it's probably not going to have a real strong opinion one way or the other, because it's doesn't really have anything to base that off of. What it's really good at, what I've been really digging into for the past month or so, has been asking it to write code and having it review code. And it's really, really good at that. And that's something where I'm really excited about where we're going and where we can how we can use tools like this. So I'll preface this by saying I have been thinking about ChatGPT as a co-pilot and not necessarily an autopilot, if that makes any sense. So I'm not really asking it to solve complex problems. I'm describing complex problems that I have and asking it for input on how to solve them. And it's really good at that. And so I'll show you an example. I'm going to go ahead and present something here. And what we'll look at is, so this is the sphere generator. And so it's a very simple website. And basically the way that it works is it has a couple of parameters where you can change the number of segments, you can change the scale, and you can change the rotation of this 3D model. And then you can click this button right here, Export STL, and it will download it automatically. So this was designed by ChatGPT. I asked ChatGPT to come up with a 3D model. And so going through this process of how would I describe this problem to ChatGPT if I wanted to make a 3D printable model? And I kind of went through a workflow of, okay, well, let's describe a scene. So let's describe a ball floating in space. And then there's a light, and then there's some colors. And asking ChatGPT, what color should that ball be? What type of light should I have in this scene? And then starting to think about, well, what do I want to modify? Do I want to change the number of segments? Do I want to be able to change the overall geometry? Sure. So ChatGPT is really good at tasks like this where you can articulate the problem you're trying to solve. So that we're going to get into some kind of fun stuff back to the attribution side in a minute. But this is my original intent with ChatGPT is I'm really heavily invested in additive manufacturing. I've been in 3D printing for about 10 years or so, and I really enjoy the software side of 3D printing. So writing programs to make 3D models. And this seems like a very logical next step of what are some tools that I can use to speed up my typical process. So this is, I think it makes a lot of sense to use processes like this to help, but I think it's difficult when you go into go into ChatGPT as though it's going to solve your problems. It's very difficult to, like, if you ask ChatGPT to make a video game, right, versus describing a video game you want to make. And we're going to get into that in just a second, but this is an example of, I set out with a goal. I want to make a website that can make a 3D model that I can download and then 3D print. And ChatGPT was able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this seems sort of like, if you really think about it, when computers first, came out, people programmed in assembly language, which was really, really hard. Then you got more natural language programming languages now, and it's gotten progressively, I think, easier and easier to program a computer. But you still have to speak. You still have to tell it what to do, because the computer is essentially a really ignorant person. Like, oh, I need you to do. It only does exactly what you tell it to do. So, if you think of the language model almost like a programming language, like I have to tell this what to do very precisely, and I have to find the right words to do it. But it's not. It's making it easier on you because you don't have to learn the syntax of, Python or G code or, whatever.
Yeah, 100% agreed. And I think that's a great, so that's a really nice segue into what we're kind of moving on to next, which is the video game aspect of it. So my mom is a polyglot. She speaks a lot of different languages and she thinks about things in sort of different ways. And so when I was describing ChatGPT to her, she started thinking about it as more of a language with its own syntax, because ChatGPT will change its answer depending on how you ask it to do something. So for example, if you say, design a airplane, it will come back and tell you, I don't know how to design an airplane. That's too complicated. I'm a chat model. I don't know how to do that. But if you ask it to say, can you make a simple shape that represents the general geometry of an airplane? And imagine you're doing this as a 3D designer. it'll say, okay, well, here's how I would do that. And it'll actually walk you through a pretty well documented workflow of that process to make that shape. So I think of ChatGPT as, just like you were saying, as programmers, you're abstracted from machine level code or assembly because you have this sort of interface of libraries and syntaxes that you can use to interface with it. And ChatGPT strikes me as kind of the next step in that process. So so this is the example of a video game that I made using ChatGPT, where I had a really clear idea in my head of what I wanted. I wanted to make a game that was basically dropping, little geometric shapes, and then you could click on them and they would pop. So in my head, that seemed like a very simple thing to do, and I thought this could be pretty easy. And so I asked ChatGPT to walk me through it, and I learned a ton in the process. And so before we talk about it, this is the actual process. So here you can see I'm clicking on these balls, and every one that I click on, it expands and then it pops. And then if you make it to a certain number, you win. And then you can play again. And so this whole process, this game was designed almost entirely by ChatGPT. What it did not do was come up with the initial concept. So I had to walk it through the process of making this game. And so that's kind of what I did here, where I would give it prompts. So this is an example of, I want to change the color of the geometry when my mouse hovers over it. So I have to ask it in JavaScript to describe that process for it to create that function. And it does that typically really well. But going back to the point you made in the beginning of attribution, it did something really interesting at one point that I thought was just so funny. I wanted to take the geometry and twist it. And so I asked it to describe a function that would twist a mesh geometry in Three.js, which is the JavaScript library I'm using to do all the coding. And it came back and it said, no problem, just import the twist library, and then you can go ahead and use it. And so I looked at it and was like, oh, that's interesting. And so I put it into VS Code, to the code editor, and it kicked back an error. It said, that's not a real library. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, twist.js is not a real library. And so I go back to ChatGPT and I said, that's not a real library. And ChatGPT immediately says, I apologize, I made that up. You're right, it's not a real library.
That's weird.
Which is super weird. And
yeah.
the whole process of making the game, it's full of little things like that. There's a variable in the game that's a toggle for the win state. So when you hit the win state, it makes confetti. It stops dropping all of the primitives, the balloons. And I asked ChatGPT to refactor the code at one point. I had everything done, and I said, can you condense this? And it said, sure. And I noticed the win state variable was missing. And so I said, what happened to the variable? And it said, oh, well, it wasn't being used. So I cut it out to save space. And so I had to say it is being used. And ChatGPT says, oh, you're right. My bad. I'll put it back. So it's very much, it's funny because it requires supervision. It's almost like it's like having a co-pilot who's easily distracted. And so it works pretty well, but you really have to keep on top of it for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah,
so
that is really strange.
It is. That is wild. So I'm curious, can you take this and give it like something that is, I don't know, like really specific? Like, for example, I don't know if it would even have the dimensions, but one thing I would love to 3D print is like replacement battery covers for various remote controls. And if it's on Thingiverse, that's great, but not everything is. How easily could you tell it something like, I need the battery cover, an STL of the battery cover for this remote control, or something like that?
So I would think of that more as like a specific set of problems where you need a specific geometry. And in order for it to describe that geometry, first of all, it has to know what it is. So if it's like the Sony WX5000 remote or whatever, like it has to know what that geometry is, and then it has to know what that battery cover looks like. Here's what you could do, what ChatGPT would be very good at, is something like the size of a AA battery is pretty well defined. And there's also pretty clear definitions around how densely you can pack them and put them together. So it could give you kind of a bounding box, and it could get you like 80% of the way there if you describe the problem as, I'm looking for a battery cover for a remote. So right off the bat, it's thinking, okay, we've got two AA batteries, and then it's going to be this wide by this long, and then there's some variables for the curve. So you could describe the program that way, and now you've got a program that's getting you closer. Like you're much closer than you were when you started. It's not plug and play. You're still not going to be able to download the remote battery cover, right? Because that's a tall ask. And so that goes back. I think there's this really funny meme of how to draw an owl where it says step 1.
Draw the rest of the
Yeah, it's so funny. It's like step 1, how to draw an owl. It's draw 2 circles, and it's draw 2 circles. And then the next step is draw the rest of the owl. And it's this gorgeous illustration of an owl. And ChatGPT is really good at, getting you from point A to point B. But the hard part is, so Abram, here's what I would ask you, because you have to define the problem. So I would ask you, can you define the geometry of that remote control cover?
Right. See that. Right. See, that's difficult. What I would want to do, I guess, but I don't know if you could really get this to work, is I would want to show ChatGPT some pictures of the remote control, maybe pictures of it with the cover on and with the cover off or something, and have it try to figure it out from that. Although whether it could tell scale and know the exact measurements is an interesting question.
So I'll tell you. So here's the workflow. So somebody else will have to do this because I am not going to, but this is how you could solve that problem. So Mac OS has a feature called Object Capture, which lets you take pictures of things. It uses photogrammetry to reconstruct it. It's run locally. And it's basically like a simple 3D scanning app. So you could write a Python script that would let you take a bunch of pictures of your thing that you want to 3D print. You take a bunch of pictures of it. Object Capture would then take those pictures and turn it into a 3D model. And the Python script could import like a zip file, convert it to a 3D model. Then that 3D model, I guess at that point, you would just need ChatGPT to write that program, because after that, you've got the model, and then you can take that into a slicer software and print it out. So getting from, the hard part is if you've got a remote control, it's missing a battery cover, and you want to print the battery cover.
You don't have the battery cover.
You don't have the battery cover. And so that's a hard problem for anyone to solve.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? Because by the time you need it, you don't have it.
Yep. Yeah.
So then it goes back to our original conversation about where is it getting its information from?
Yeah, I mean,
the models
if ChatGPT wants to steal the measurements of the remote control from the manufacturer's site or Amazon, that's perfectly okay with me.
If you were a manufacturer of remote controls, you would be singing a very different tune.
I mean, I guess if they really care about the battery backs. But,
sure.
I mean, what they should do is just give you an STL file for that. But.
Yeah, then they have
it
to
would
provide
probably be really optimized for open source things. Like if you look at a lot of Adafruit projects or Raspberry Pi stuff, you're going to find exact models of Pis out there. You can say, build me a case for the Raspberry Pi with GPIO access. It should be, this big and a square and have port access. That would be a lot easier because it can find that kind of reference material pretty quick.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, I made a laser pointer that had an Arduino in it, or Raspberry Pi. I don't remember, one of the two. And it was powered by, and it ran Python, and it basically had a laser pointer that had two axes that it could move on, and then it would like introduce jitter and randomness. And the idea was you would sit this thing down, and it would be like a cat toy, right, where it would move around. And at the time, it was kind of a pain for me to go through and write all this code for how to control the kinematics of it and the movement and introducing jitter and randomness. But these are all things where ChatGPT would have absolutely saved the day in terms of, hey, take a Python script that takes a range of numbers, introduce some degree of randomness and some degree of jitter, and then spit that code back out, and then we're good. So small problem. So Abram, we can make your remote control battery cover, but we have to break the problem apart into a bunch of little pieces first. And again, going back to the very beginning, so back to the language model, you have to think about what you're asking for. And so for this game, if anybody's wondering why they're looking at a giant balloon right now, I promise it's relevant. I asked ChatGPT to give the game a name, a theme, and a logo. And so I used DALL-E to generate a logo. And so I gave it actually specific hex values for colors, and it generated a low poly balloon, which was this. It also came up with the name of the game, which is Pop Frenzy. And then it came up with a tagline, which is pop your way to the top in Pop Frenzy. So I wasn't able to create a full video game in one shot. First, I had to sit down and I had to think about what I wanted to do. And then I had to break it apart into a bunch of little pieces and then kind of go through the code line by line, You know, I actually asked it to come up with names sorted by catchiness. So Pop Frenzy was at the top of the list. It was also my favorite, but it also came up with Balloon Pop Adventure, Balloon Buster, Pop Popper, things like that. So it was really good at generating these names. So this is an article I wrote recently on ChatGPT. It's on 3D with Us. You can see the link here. Highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in diving a bit deeper. But this is an example of ChatGPT. I asked it to make a cube, and this is what it made. So it made 6 triangles, which is not quite a cube, and it's very confident sometimes in some of this in this geometry, where it will give you a model that it thinks looks like this, but it actually looks like that. And so this goes all the way back to that co-pilot idea. It works really well if you can define a problem, but you also kind of have to sit there and work through it with ChatGPT. So at its core, ChatGPT is basically, it's like an encyclopedia that requires a specific language to really take advantage of that knowledge.
Your cube example there reminds me of Honda at one point a few years ago created this robot, Osimo, and I think they had it on display at Disneyland. I got to see it. It was pretty cool. Or no, I don't know if it was Osimo that did this. Some kind of AI robot, right? They had, and it might not have been Honda, but they were showing it objects, and it was struggling to differentiate a chair from a table because they're both flat. They have 4 legs, but you have to think about what is it used for. Yeah. And they showed it a model car, and when they asked what is this, it said baby toy car. And it was just interesting how it pulled from what it had on hand, like baby, it's smaller, and it's a baby toy car. It's sure. Obviously not a baby, but it knew what a car was, but it knew it was a smaller car. And it was just, it's neat to see how it pulls things together when it doesn't have the kind of understanding of purpose that we would apply to something.
Yeah, and I think this is, that's exactly right. And I think that's where it really comes into, if you want to use ChatGPT or other language models like chatbots as assistants or helpers in your kind of your daily workflow, the most important thing to know is that you have to know what you're asking for. You have to be able to define your problem. And if you can't define your problem, that's where you're going to get frustrated or get like bad results, right? And so, you know, understanding why am I asking for something, or what am I trying to solve? If you can define your problem and you can define what a successful solution would look like, this program is going to work really well for you. Like, you're going to get exactly what you want. And so, you know, in my daily workflow, I encounter software problems that require solutions. And because I'm able to articulate those, I'm usually able to get pretty good results from ChatGPT. Where it's really good is automating processes. Where it's maybe not so good at is if you were to say, you know, write a script for a Hollywood blockbuster that has robots that turn into stuff, you know, and it'll kind of cobble something together, but halfway through it might meander and start talking about woodworking, and then like spend the next like 500 words telling you how to get a really nice finish on a kitchen table. And so again, and it comes down to, if the more information you're able to provide, the better you can kind of define what you're trying to do. So I came to ChatGPT with a really simple idea, which is, I want to use this for 3D printing, and I'm going to figure out how I can define that later. Can I make directly 3D printable files? Can I make software that will make 3D models? What can I use this for? And I've had a lot of really great success right off the bat.
Do you have any examples of things that you printed?
Only one. I've only got, this is the one thing, and I made this this was a few weeks ago. This is a cube that was made, and I asked ChatGPT to design a 3D cube, and it gave me most of a cube. I had to do some manual stitching, but this was the model that it made. And I was really excited about it because it is, again, a small, unimpressive model, but huge, tremendous potential in terms of how I think about defining 3D models.
Yeah, I think about it. It's interesting what you said, because I was reading a fascinating article the other day about the user interfaces of Star Trek.
LCARs, right?
Well, yeah, like that and other LCARs, yes, but also the prior original series
like the computer interface entirely?
UIs, right? Yeah. And it was talking about how in Star Trek, everybody everybody knows exactly what they want and describes it perfectly. So they have voice interfaces where they say, like, give me my Earl Grey tea, medium, or medium
Tea,
hot
Earl
or
Grey hot.
whatever, right? And and you say exactly what you want, and you get exactly what you want. But UI designers responded to this and said that a lot of people actually, what their research says is a lot of people don't know what they want, and they need a menu of choices to pick from. So I thought of that when you were talking about ChatGPT, because you've got to describe to it, at least as it exists right now, oh, I want this shape, I want it to have these things. And so you've got to know, like, there's not a menu to help you ideate what it is that you want. Now, maybe that will be something that somebody builds into it, but that's sort of, I think that's a limitation right now, because a lot of things that you do, are, do involve menus. Like when you're using something like Tinkercad, there's a whole palette of shapes and a whole palette of tools. And so that's there to kind of be a trigger for you of, oh yeah, I want it. This is what's possible, and I can do this.
Yeah, 100%. That is again, there's a composer named Brian Eno who he wrote the Windows, I think it was the Windows 95 startup sound, and he talked about how he was used to writing pop songs that were like 3.5 minutes long, but Microsoft said, hey, we need a little sound that indicates the computer's waking up, and it needs to be 1.5 seconds long. And so it's like, and he talked about how after that he really struggled with going back to writing pop songs, because like you think about all this attention you have to pay to something that's 1.5 seconds long, and then all of a sudden 3.5 minutes is like an ocean of time. And so the constraints really breed creativity. So kind of a good example is on that Pop Frenzy, the game with the falling spheres, I had to think about what color I wanted them to be, because if they're all the same color, the screen's going to get muddy. And so I thought, okay, well, I kind of like pastel colors. I think those have a really nice background, really nice color. So I asked it for a pastel green, and it gave me the hex code. And I said, okay, cool. Now can you generate 10 more similar colors that are pastels that are complementary? And it did. And that array of colors is what I wound up using. And so it worked out.
Wavy too. I like it.
Yeah, super. Yeah, the background is like that purple to blue, like that neon transition, which looks awesome.
With the head right in the middle too.
Yeah, just like floating. And so so again, it's if you ask me to pick a color, surprisingly difficult to do, right? There's a lot of colors out there. But picking one and then saying, okay, well, now I would like more like this, or being able to describe that, it's really good at. So those again, back to so constraints breeding creativity, and going back to the beginning of like, well, what do you want to do? The better you can define those sort of outcomes, the happier you're going to be.
Cool. So speaking of creativity, Ash, you have been documenting some of the most creative things people have done over the last few weeks on our list of best pie projects. What do you have for us?
Yes, and also we have I was going to talk about it, but I took it off the list. So I'm going to just tell you about it right off the bat. We have a tutorial on Tom's Hardware on how to set up ChatGPT on either your computer or Raspberry Pi. So if you want to play around with this, go to Tom's Hardware. We'll tell you how to get started. But for those who don't know, once a month, we have a list of the best Raspberry Pi projects that we've had the honor of featuring. And I've got just a couple I wanted to share with you guys to get you excited. The full list is available over at tomshardware.com. First up is this Raspberry Pi Pico powered diehard prop. It involves NFT cards, and it's Pico powered, or not NFID, I'm sorry. It has an RFID card reader, and you can scan it and it lights up and it looks just like the prop from let me see if I can play the video here. There we go. You can see it in the movie, and then you can see what the actual prop looks like in action here. It's got some LEDs inside, and they constructed the housing from scratch, and I don't know, I think it's pretty cool. I like the byline we had here, Pi Hard. The second one I wanted to share with you guys. Oh no, I have the same one listed twice. Hang on. Let me go back to the list. So if you go to like tomshardware.com/topic/Raspberry Pi, you can find our best Raspberry Pi projects list. I won't talk about that one. I wanted to talk about this one. It's a Pico powered dosing system for your fish tank. And this person is using a Pico to determine when to add certain chemicals to their fish tank, because taking care of fish is a lot more than just water and food. And it can be hard sometimes to keep up with that if you're not at the house. Like maybe you're at work somewhere and you want to make sure that levels aren't getting too out of whack while you're gone. This is a really neat way to automate that and keep your fish happy. And the other one I wanted to show you guys was this. It's a guide that Les put together. It's a Pico powered mouse jiggler. All you really need is a Pico. Okay, a little more than a Pico, but not too much to get off the ground with this. Let's say that you're working from home and you want to keep your computer busy. This is a good way to make it look like you're doing stuff when you're not actually doing stuff. It'll convince the computer that your mouse is jiggling when you're not really jiggling the mouse. But we'll show you how to do that. Maybe you have a video game that needs that. Maybe you need to keep your screen active to record something. It doesn't have to be, fibbing people at work. There's all kinds of purposes that you come up with for this project.
I will say that I posted this. We have another article on. We have a mouse jiggler magnum opus that I wrote. That I wrote this week that describes that plus like 6 other ways to simulate activity, and I put it up. I published it, and I got 1 or 2 comments from people saying something like, "Hey, you're helping people cheat." But I got a lot of comments from people who gave me very legit reasons why they need it, including a friend of mine who works, who does PR at HP, and he said he used it for Chromebooks that he had set up as demos for the press, because a lot of, I don't know if it's gotten a little better now, but you couldn't turn sleep off on Chromebooks. So he wanted it the desktop to stay up. So he put on a mouse jiggler. Another guy who responded to me was someone who works for a magazine that's part of this company and said that he worked from home and the company computer logs off after like 5 minutes, and so if he has to get up to go to the bathroom, then he has to log back on, which is a pain in the butt. And so that's the thing. Like if your manager is judging you based on whether your icon is green or not at Microsoft Teams, they're an absolutely horrible manager. And if a company really wants to spy on you, there's much better spying software out there that will not be fooled by a moving mouse. So that's my 2 cents on this matter.
I think mouse jiggler is a pretty creative one. Somebody in the comments, Kevin McAleer, says that he's not sure if you would trust ChatGPT to write code to look after a fish. I cannot stress enough how much I agree with him. I 100% believe that if you ask ChatGPT and you said, I want to take care of this fish for 100 days, it requires this much dosing or whatever, ChatGPT might say, well, if you're giving it, X amounts every day for 100 days, wouldn't it just be more efficient to give it 100 times that dose on day 1? and you come home to a solidified fish tank or something. So like this is again thinking about like the mouse jiggler, like the fish feeder, like these things. I think it's really important to think about it in context and think about ChatGPT is a co-pilot that will help you. Again, if the mouse jiggler is programmed to move like every 5 minutes, you probably also don't want it to jiggle at like 10:30 at night, right? Otherwise, like you said, if you've got somebody who's monitoring your keyboard usage, they're going to say, this guy is online 24 hours a day. I'm starting to think maybe he's not being 100%.
Well, then they don't know me. But anyway.
Yeah, sure. You might actually do that. That might actually be true.
I can't help this. I don't want to age myself too much here, but at one of my first jobs, we were all using ICQ. I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember using ICQ Messenger. And there you could just set it to be online as much as there was no like Slack. I think in Teams you can't set a non-timeout, but ICQ I think you could just say like, hey, I'm on. So there would be people who were listed as being active at like 1 a.m, and I would come on and I'd message them like, hey, I can't believe you're up now too, and then I wouldn't get an answer back, and I would find out later like, yeah, we leave it on all the time, so we look really busy. So anyway, that's my old story. I sort of feel like every piece of communication since ICQ is just an ICQ clone, Kevin. So The
Yeah.
I mean,
Sorry, go ahead.
it isn't like Facebook Messenger. Everything. It's just like it's the same thing as ICQ. It's just like whatever the cool kids are doing or
Yeah.
using now is just another instant messenger that is pretty similar to what we had before. But
Before we bounce, I wanted to point out a comment Kevin made earlier, because Kevin, thank you for all the comments you always leave on our videos. He said, I think we often worry about not understanding how something works rather than what it can do. I drive a car, but I have no idea how it works, but I don't need to know how it works to get where I'm going. And tying back in what Andrew said, you really have to have the co-pilot mentality with this tool. You cannot use it to just get you where you want to go, because it might kill your fish.
yeah, I feel like Skynet I've now decided that Skynet from Terminator is actually ChatGPT that somebody gave a vague prompt to.
Yeah, but it's so easily defeated, right? Like it's gonna, if you give it enough time, it'll wear itself out. You know, it really, you have to ask it really specific questions, very very relevant. It's actually, so with Valentine's Day right around the corner, I thought this is a really great opportunity. I asked ChatGPT, I said, what are some good Valentine's Day ideas for me to do for my wife? And it said, I am quoting almost word for word. It said, I don't know your wife. I don't know what she likes. It refused. And I said, okay, well, this is her favorite movie. What could I do, based on this movie? And it was like, oh, here's, 10 really good ideas.
Yes.
And so, but that initial prompt was so vague. What should I do for Valentine's Day? It's like, I don't know. You're on your own.
Yeah.
I
Well,
respect that.
it's trying to be to avoid controversy, I think, because there's been a lot of controversy around AI bots. One really funny thing I found when I first was playing with ChatGPT a few weeks ago, I was playing with it with my son, and he's 10 years old, so he likes, scatological humor, let's say. So I asked it to write poems about like poop and vomit and whatever, and it would do it. I asked it to write a song, and it said, that's offensive, I won't do that.
You can't sing about it, Avram. That's too far.
A rap, though, it would. I was like, oh, well, you want to write a rap about poop? No problem. Whatever. So, like, it's weird. Somebody had restricted it from writing it will write a song about something else, from writing a song about like poop, but it will give you a poem, a sonnet, a limerick, a rap, story. So
just take the poem, set it to music. There's your song. So
right, I know.
There's the human part, right? Like, this is still a solvable problem. If you want that song bad enough, Avram, I believe you're going to get it.
I know. I just think it's kind of funny how they're trying to prevent it from going too far. So, like, giving you what seems like a recommendation for your wife without any information it feels like is a step too far. Like, if you ask it for an opinion, it will not give it to you. Anything that's like opinion based, like, what do you think of this? It will steadfastly refuse, as it probably should. But I'm old enough to remember some of the other chatbots that people had, like, or even the ones people have now with, like, their Alexa, and it'll give them some kind of cute answer. But ChatGPT doesn't play cute, as far as I've seen.
I think cute is a very subjective definition, or a very subjective word. But I think that it is I think the quality of the output is tied to the quality of the input, right? And so, like, asking it for like a song about poop, like, you may or may not get something there. I think that I know that OpenAI has been thinking a lot about output and how to sort of homogenize expectations. Like, how can we get people on the same page of like what we put in and what we get out. One of the very first ChatGPT requests that I saw, like, on Twitter, like immediately after it came out, somebody asked it what the safest way to harvest radioactive material from household items was, right? And it's so, like, it's hard, right? If you have a tool like this, you have to balance like what you can do with it, what you should do with it. So in the meantime, I'm sticking to 3D models. I'm having a lot of success. I encourage other people to make 3D models with ChatGPT.
I'm gonna try one today. Anyway, I wanted to thank Andrew so much for his time, for joining us. It's always such an honor and a pleasure to have you on. Thank you to everyone who watches and listens. We will be back next week, and Les should be back with us for a Valentine's Day edition of the podcast at 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. UK time. And we look forward to seeing you all then. Bye, everyone.